John Turbill, yeah, Threatened Species Officer. I'm working on the koala projects on the North Coast. I'm based in Coffs Harbour and have been working sort of on and off koalas for about 25 years, delivering the government's, in the recent years, Koala Saving Our Species program. That includes a number of projects on private lands, working with councils and doing quite a bit of research. We did a lot of post-fire surveys, for example, after the big fires in 2019, about 450 sites across national parks to see how koalas were doing after the fires. And we also work with a lot of landowners and community on projects. So tonight, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background information on koalas in the Hunter Local Land Services area. So just a bit of background. Koalas are listed as vulnerable in Queensland, New South Wales and the ACT. So that means they're listed under the Biodiversity Conservation Act. They're not listed as threatened in Victoria or South Australia. This map here, you can see, is the distribution of koalas that is known, but the distribution is now slowly altering from the west going to the east because of things like historic land clearing, and also there's been quite a bit of climate change influence on our western koala populations over time, with long droughts and increasing heat during summer, and koalas are susceptible to extreme heat days and where they need to then go in search of water. So the population is decreasing incredibly quickly out in some areas like the Pelago, where we've now had population declines of about 95% in the last few years, which is pretty sad, which means that populations coming towards the east and around the coastal areas are becoming more and more important for koalas. They're also listed as vulnerable in the Commonwealth by the federal government as well. So just a little bit on koala biology. Koalas are considered a highly specialised species that historically range from the north of Queensland right down in the southern Victoria. They're highly specialised because they live in trees. They're arboreal. They only eat certain types of trees, the leaves of certain trees. Their populations aren't continuous across those areas. They have subpopulations separated by things like cleared land, unsuitable habitat such as like rainforest or heathlands, and other barriers like major river systems, mountains, things like that. So there's subpopulations across their areas. They're pretty fussy about what they eat. They only particularly eat a small number of feed trees, mostly eucalypts, which are limited by a number of environmental factors, such as, they like to eat trees that are on high fertility soils, for example, not in too steep a topography and not too high in elevation. And there's climatic limitations. They don't like very, very cold climates, and they particularly don't like very hot areas like out west where temperatures are above 30 degrees for days on end. That doesn't, koalas can't handle those temperatures for too long. And individual koalas, females and males, establish a home range, which is generally overlapped by an alpha male. And the home range depends on the quality of the habitat. So it can range from as small as 1 to 2 hectares for one koala. In some of the populations on poorer soils or poorer quality, it can be hundreds of hectares, where koalas have to range over quite a large area, so they spend more time on the ground, walking between the trees. Their climatic envelope, which is the sort of climatic and weather conditions they can live in, is generally within areas of a maximum temperature around 28-30 degrees and a mean annual rainfall around the 700 to 1500 mark. So they're not particularly well adapted to arid areas out west, and they don't do very well in very hot climates or very cold climates. Females start to breed at about 2 years of age or so and usually produce 1 joey a year, and births occur in spring and summer. And males become sexually mature about 3 years of age. So they're not prolific breeders. They can have 1 joey a year, and they usually take 2 or 3 years of age before they can start to have joeys, and a female will breed for something like 6 to 8 years. Koalas in the wild can live up to 12 years of age, depending on the presence of other things like disease. If disease is very present in the population, it can be a limiting factor, or other threats such as like roadkill. There's other threats I'll talk about later, but there's some things that prevent them getting too old sometimes, but they're generally about 12 years of age. The younger koalas live with their mothers, but then they disperse at about 1.5 to 3 years of age. They leave their mother's territory. They go looking for their own territory or their own home range. This is when they're particularly vulnerable to threats of getting taken by a dog or hit by a car, for example, or under stress from not finding a home range, bumping into other males or females. So young koalas have a fairly difficult time often establishing their own home range away from their mothers. Koalas are generally thought to get moisture from the leaves they eat, which is their daily water intake. They can take it from the leaves, they can lick dew off the leaves, and in a generally good climate, most of the water, all the water they get is taken from the leaves they eat. But this is not the case for a lot of animals now out west where the climate's getting very dry and hot. And in those cases, you've probably seen photos of koalas down on the ground licking water from toilet bowls or dog bowls or trying to get into cattle troughs. So in those hot drought conditions where the leaves aren't producing moisture and koalas have to go seeking moisture somewhere else. In those times, koalas will move in drought or hot weather. They'll move into areas of higher soil moisture, and microclimates such as gullies and drainage lines, just to get moisture and eat leaves that have got a high moisture content. And the reliance of koalas on a select number of species and individual trees for foraging is linked to both the leaf moisture just talked about, and also the fact that all eucalypts produce toxins in their leaves, primarily to stop the leaves being predated on by insect attack. So koalas have to be particularly careful and select the trees that have a lower toxin level and generally a high nutrient and protein level, so they can get the maximum out of the leaves and virtually don't poison themselves. So they're quite selective in not only the species they eat, but the individual trees within those species that have a low toxin load. That's a little bit of background. Now, in the Hunter LLS area, this is a map of the red dots of all the koala records we have in our BioNet data system, going back from 1997 to 2017 or so. You can see that cluster of records around Wingham, Taree, some of the state forests and national parks, particularly down around Raymond Terrace and Port Stephens. These are areas of known high quality koala, or historically high quality koala habitat and koala populations. There are records going out to the west there, you can see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that where there's not a record, there's not koalas. It just means that records come into the system by doing surveys for forestry or other surveys, but they also are linked to where people live, because that's where people are seeing more koalas. So those western areas around Scone, Muswellbrook, there are some populations there. We just don't have many records because we haven't done a lot of survey, or people aren't reporting because of the farmlands are bigger properties and that sort of thing. But it does give us a pretty good indication of where koalas and the high density populations that we presently know are occurring. What we've done with those records using a spatial analysis on our computer is to look at what we call areas of regional koala significance. And these areas you can see there with those little square lines around them are what we call area of regional koala significance, or ARCs, that we predominantly know have good historic populations, demonstrating what we would call generational persistence. So the records date back chronologically over numbers of koala generations. So we know that animals have been persisting there for a long period of time. And we do this for up to 6 koala generations, which is 36 years. And that gives us an idea where koala populations are occurring and where they're historically been occurring and are still there and present. And it gives us a good way of mapping out koalas and where to go look for koalas and where to concentrate efforts for koala management. The areas of regional significance that we have mapped, here's a couple of examples of 2 of them, Koala and Cap and Hat, areas of regional koala significance. We map those areas out based on those records that I just showed you. And within those areas, then we can look at mapping out some functional issues about regional habitat, its quality, and look at some of the likely threats that are occurring in those regional areas, such as fragmentation of the habitat, wildfire, vehicle strike, heat stress, disease, dog attack and climate change. So for each of those areas, excuse me, we can work out at a regional scale how the population is going in a historic and present time, and also what are the threats operating on those koalas in those areas, and what management issues and responses we might be able to make to those threats. And we've got those ARCs and regional assessments for each of those areas I showed in the previous slide. So moving on to some of the work we've done under our saving species funded projects. We did further surveys in those 2 ARC areas, Koala and Cap and Hat. And they show that they both contain significant koala populations, particularly on private lands as well. Whilst the koala habitat in those areas was highly fragmented, so it wasn't particularly linked together that well, the study identified that there was a relatively high koala densities of nearly 1 koala per hectare. So that's quite a high density of animals. So that shows the habitat quality was quite high. The study recommended these areas should be a priority for koala management and conservation, including looking at managing the landscape occupation of the koalas by increasing the connectivity between the patches, trying to enhance habitat extent and quality, and looking at managing any of the other threats such as vehicle strike, dog attacks. Any land clearing or wildfire was a particularly emerging problem. The study also found that the primary food trees in those areas were tallowood, small fruited grey gum, forest red gum, grey box, Ruther's box, and in the wetter areas, swamp mahogany. So they were the main food trees, but they're also using other species. They particularly not just need those food trees, but they need shelter trees to get into in warm days or cold days. So they need a variety of trees for both feeding in and sheltering. So now looking at the threats that operate on koalas on these populations. Obviously, a pretty obvious one is urban expansion and land clearing that takes out habitat and contributes to loss and fragmentation of the habitat. Particularly where these sort of large subdivisions back onto existing habitat, then you have that interface of koalas still trying to move into those areas where they historically might have been using those areas, and where those trees might still be occurring in the subdivisions in people's backyards. Koalas may still try to access those areas, and they can then get into trouble on the roadways and interacting with people's dogs in their backyards, or just roaming dogs that are let loose to roam in the adjoining bushland. And we have that problem in lots of subdivisions. Additionally, forestry on private and public land where it is not just selective logging, but more of an intensity of logging, can remove particular koala food trees and reduce the available habitat. As I mentioned before, koalas are very selective about their food trees, and in some cases, just removing those food trees that koalas are using is quite make koalas very difficult to find food trees in their area, even though there's remaining trees, the ones that they were particularly using for feed or shelter, have been removed by forestry, has a major impact on the koalas. So retention of a number of koala food trees and shelter trees during any proposed logging or forestry greatly enhances their long-term survival of individual koalas whilst that activity is happening. Another problem we have in areas where there's koala populations adjacent to or bisected by busy roads, particularly roads where speeds are above 50, 60 kilometres an hour. We often have what we call koala hotspots, where koalas are, or black spots, where koalas are hit by vehicles, particularly in the spring breeding season when many of the animals are on the move and they're moving through their territories. I don't know whether people have noticed the floppy top fencing up the top right there, where there's a koala trying to climb that fence. Most of the Pacific Highway and some other busy roads now have this koala-proof fencing along the roads. That fencing folds back on itself, so a koala can't climb from the outside of the road to enter the road, but it can climb the other way from the road over and fall back into its habitat. They're put there to try and protect koalas entering the road and directs them to underpasses and overpasses. And you can see there the photo of the major overpass, 60 metres wide on the Pacific Highway at Raleigh, just south of Coffs Harbour, where we've got photos of cameras, photos using fauna cameras of koalas using that overpass, and they certainly use underpasses. So we're trying to make sure that road barriers are not killing koalas on the road, but fencing them off into the habitat, but allowing them to traverse across the road as well. So in urban areas where there's lighting and lower speed and the road verge is cleared or mowed, allows vehicles and drivers to get a better view of the road and be able to slow down or avoid koalas when they're coming across the road. But in areas such as that photo in the middle, where there's vegetation right up the road and it's high speed, it's very difficult to avoid koalas. So roadkill is a significant problem for koalas in many areas along the coast where there's high traffic flows just after dark in particular. Dog attack is also an issue for koalas, particularly around and adjoining urban and peri-urban areas where there could be roaming dogs or roaming dog packs. Also where koalas venture into urban areas looking for their food trees, or where there are food trees still remaining, they can often come into contact with domestic dogs, climbing into backyards, for example, where there might be a dog in the backyard and the dog suddenly sees a koala and wants to defend itself. So we do have problems with koalas entering into yards or being attacked by dogs that are let loose and not being kept in the yard or locked up at night, particularly again in the breeding season from about August to February, when koalas are more on the move. And often koalas appear not to be injured, but there's puncture marks caused by dogs, which the animal goes off into the bush and dies. So making sure that you've got your dog on a leash when you're walking in bushland areas, and particularly keeping it locked up at night, is very important in protecting koalas in and around their habitat. Oops. As everyone would have been aware of the large fires that happened in 2019, early 2020, very large area of habitat for koalas was burnt. The fires, whilst they had a very high intensity in many areas, also were quite mosaic in their burning. So they might burn very hot in one area, they jump across gullies or southern face areas, and those are areas where what we call refugia, where maybe the understory is slightly burnt but the canopy wasn't burnt. They allowed koalas to survive even though the fires were so intense. Where there was canopy fires, the koalas were just in the trees, and so they would have perished. But unfortunately, even then, when koalas survive, they lack areas for food. They are often very dehydrated from the heat, and often they burn their paws and then find it very difficult to climb trees, and can then often starve because they can't get up trees. So many koalas came into care and had to be managed. There's a picture there of a koala with a burnt claw being managed in the koala hospital. We did a lot of koala post-fire surveys and found that on average, at 450 sites we visited, about 40% of them still had a presence of koalas in those refuge unburnt patches. So that was very encouraging. And we're hoping that koalas will move out back into those areas as those forests regenerate over time. But keeping fire out, and particularly even when you're doing prescribed burns, it's important to try and keep the fire intensity low and the flame height less than a couple of meters, particularly not going up tree trunks or particularly getting into the canopy. So fire is a major impact that needs to be protected as possible as well. Disease in koalas is a growing factor, often where koalas under stress in and around urban areas or where the habitat's being disturbed. They're on the ground looking for, trying to move between habitat. Chlamydia is one of the most well-known koala diseases. The clinical signs of that is wet bottom, like urinary tract infection, conjunctivitis, which can cause blindness. And these signs are not always apparent or obvious in animals sighted in the wild, but the disease is throughout most populations. There are some populations that don't have it. In severe chlamydia cases, females can become infertile and not breed, which is not a good outcome for those animals, and often they will die from the effects of chlamydia and urinary tract infections. Koalas are taken into care. That's one of their main issues coming into care for treatment, and often they can be treated and released back into the wild. But it's thought that high levels of stress associated with habitat disturbance and exposure to predators or extremes to weather, where koalas tend to get stressed, tends to make chlamydia more of a problem for koalas. So anyone that sees a koala with either the signs of conjunctivitis or wet bottom should try and report that to WIRES or to council, so that or our department, so that they can be captured and taken into care and treated. As I mentioned, koalas, particularly out west, climate change and heat stress and drought are starting to impact koalas. We've always had drought and heat in the western populations, but it's starting to get extreme, and the recent droughts were a major problem where we had a very big death toll of koalas, particularly where temperatures now are getting into the high 30s and even 40s. And whilst in the past they have gone there for a day or two, they're now occurring at that temperature for numbers of consecutive days. And koalas just cannot take that heat or dryness. They're not getting any moisture now from the leaves, and so they must come down and seek moisture or water. This puts them at a lot of stress to predators and car vehicles trying to find water. And you've probably seen numbers of these photos of animals coming in and drinking out of pools or toilet bowls. The picture at the top right is what we call a koala drinker. Some of these, quite a few of these have been produced and put out into some of these western areas where koalas can come down and drink from that bowl during heat stress. But obviously we can't put them out in every population in every area. And as I mentioned, some of these western populations have had severe declines of up to 95%. And that's getting pretty worrying effects. So the population is shrinking from the west towards the east, making sort of the Tamworth and Western Slopes populations quite significant, and Armidale. Conservation through landholders and the community is a really important part of our work. We had a koala plan of management under saving our species for securing populations, working with lots of landowners, national parks, children's groups, school groups, giving days, talking to council staff and other people. How do you find koalas? Where do you look for them? What do you do when you find them? A whole range of things like that. And we're continuing this with 4 partnerships at the moment, and we want to extend that even further. With partnerships in the northeast, a partnership in Northern Tablelands, one in the Port Macquarie, Hastings area, and one in the Southern Highlands, where we have a koala ecologist working local land services, Landcare councils and the community to run field days, community planting days, conservation agreements with landowners, etc. And they're being highly successful. We want to continue that work. We now have this website that people can go to called the New South Wales Koala Country. That's the link there on the page. On that website, there's a lot of information about stories that people are doing, community landowners, councils, telling their stories about what they're doing, how they find their koalas, what work they're doing. We have resources, number of resources on that page too. Best practice guidelines for a number of different things, particularly koala habitat restoration guidelines for different areas of the state. Gives a lot of information about how to plant trees, how to go about it, what are the particular food trees for your area, how to source the trees, how to manage them and protect them over the first few years to make sure they grow into full trees. That information's on there. We also have best practice guidelines for dealing with koalas on roads for councils and other people to deal with when they're building new road structures or subdivisions, how to deal with koalas and manage them on roadways, keep them safe. Also on the site, we have a guideline for how to manage dogs around koala habitat, domestic dogs, feral dogs or roaming dog packs. Also working with the community, case studies of how people have gone about koala habitat restoration, running a koala restoration program with volunteers and different templates for working volunteers, guidelines how to write successful grant applications, a whole range of things in there to help people get involved, the community with Landcare and LLS, all those things to help get the koala projects up and running. As part of that website, we also have a thing, an app which you can download through the App Store or Google Play, available for both types of phone, Androids and Apple phones. It's called the I Spy Koala. Once that's on your phone and you see a koala and you're at that point, you can put that record into through the I Spy app into our Bionet Atlas records for the state. And that record will go in, so that will help us know where that koala was and the time and date that it was there. And you can put other information in there about it as well. So I encourage people to download that app, because that really helps us get more records in the system about koala locations and how they're doing, the time of day, or not time of day, the date of where that record was. That's all very good, helpful information. Council also has a register, I think, of koalas that Matt will talk about. And oops, that's it.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Very interesting. Got a couple of questions here. Yep, you can see your video there. Yep. That's good. So someone's asked what eucalyptus species do they like? I think Matt's going to put up a pretty extensive list on the particular eucalyptus species that they like. But I was thinking, John, did you want to mention something about maybe how the koalas prefer certain vegetation types on certain soils?
Yeah.
Something about that, perhaps?
Yeah, look, there's a long list of food trees that koala use, food trees and shelter trees. But primarily there's a smaller list of trees that they really like to use. We call those the primary trees, and then we call the others secondary trees. So there's a range of trees like in this area, tallowood, small fruited grey gum, forest red gum, grey box and rudder's box. and swamp mahogany are some of the main trees, but I think Matt has a longer list. And if anyone's interested, I can supply them with a list of trees for their area. It's good to try and plant trees that are occurring in the natural bush adjacent to the area you want to plant in. So if you can look at what are the tree species occurring naturally in the bushland on your property, and then try and mimic a species mix pretty similar to that. Species mix would be a good way of going about it, and trying to also source the trees from a local nursery of local providence. So you're not getting tallow woods that have been grown 500 kilometres away, but you're trying to get trees of local seed provenance is also a good way to go as well. Yeah.
Thanks, John. And yeah, it reminds me of the importance of shade trees too for anyone out in the western area. The importance of putting in some of those, species like currajong or casuarinas, those sorts of things. Yep.
Yep. Acacias. It's a good, it's good to plant a good range of trees as well as the primary food trees. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. Another one here about colour-bond fencing in urban areas. Is there anything people can do to allow koalas to move through those areas, or is that an issue, the colour-bond fences?
Well, there's two issues there. There's the issue of not wanting koalas into your backyard. So if you've got a backyard that might have some trees that koalas might want to go into, or they just happen to be wanting to cross that area, and you've got a dog in the yard, then probably you wouldn't want the koala to enter your yard. So a colour-bond fence that doesn't have any grip holes, like it's all metal, it doesn't have any wood, and it's reasonably high. I think they're, about head high, most of them, or a bit higher. That's probably a good way to go, because that stops koalas getting into the yard. If you've got a dog in there, we don't want the dog and the koala meeting each other primarily. If you have a yard that has colour-bond and you want the koala to possibly enter the yard, if you've got trees or the koala want to move there, you can put things like wooden posts against the fence for it to climb up and across and down over the fence, or lattice work, that pine lattice work that people grow plants on, put up against a couple of posts is often good, as long as it goes up to the top of the fence and allows the animal to climb up over and down the other side. There are a couple of alternatives. So there's the two things. You don't want the animal in there because it's going to be a threat to the koala. So making sure there's nothing there like shrubs or anything like that, or posts that it can climb up over and into the yard. Or the opposite is to put timber or lattice work to allow it to climb up and move over the fence safely. Yeah.
Thank you. And another one here about tree recommendations for the Upper Hunter area. So I'll just remind people too that we have, Hunter LLS has done a koala fact sheet that has recommendations on tree species on there that's available on our website. But yeah, any information there, John, for the Upper Hunter?
Look, each area is probably fairly specific about what the tree species are. They probably would need to look at where that location was in particular. If people wanted to send in or phone in or contact us about that particular area, we could be a bit more specific about the tree species that would be suitable for those areas. Yeah.
Yep.
It's probably the best way to go.
Yep. Yeah, there's lots of eucalypt box species out there. So things like grey gum, bimble box, those sorts of things. But yeah, the importance of putting in shade trees as well.
Yeah.
With the rising temperatures. But thanks for that. So I'm interested. Another question here. I'm interested in a list of trees for our area, Fosterton near Dungog. So yeah, perhaps I think we might have already answered that. And I think Matt Bell might speak a bit more about this, but we can. So the fact sheet provides some pretty good information on there as well that I just mentioned.
And also, if people will link into that Koala Country website, I put the link up, and we can supply the habitat restoration guideline resource guideline has a full list of koala tree species for each region in it as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yep. Another one. Yes. What's the fastest growing koala tree to plant now?
That's a difficult question. Look, most of the koala trees, if they can be protected from browsing by swamp wallabies and things like that, and they're managed quite well, like a tree guard, fertilised and watered, and have mulch on them. Often koalas will be in using them within, sometimes 3 to 5 years. But definitely by 8 to 10 years, it's developing into a tree that koalas will definitely visit and use. But sometimes I've seen trees in the Lismore area where they're growing on high fertility soil, for example, and you've got a good season, a couple of good seasons, not a drought. 5 years, the tree is up to 3 to 5 metres high and being browsed by animals. Yeah.
Thanks, John. And I think that's it for the questions for now. So, yep, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, so now hand over to Matt. So, Matt Bell's a senior ecologist at MidCoast Council. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Okay, so I should be sharing my screen now. Is that all looking okay?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, so yeah, firstly, I'd like to thank, thanks John and thanks Reegan for facilitating the webinar. I'd certainly like to also recognise and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are. And for me, that's the Gatung speaking people. Pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and elders past, present and emerging. Ooh. Okay, so I'll get into my presentation. I've got a fair bit to cover. And I like talking about koalas, so I'll get straight into it. So the koala is an important native species. It's distinctly iconic, easily recognizable, and it's frequently used to represent the uniqueness and specialness of Australian wildlife. The observation of a free-living koala is always popular. It's always a special wildlife experience, even for people who've seen them often. And it reinforces the affinity that people have with koalas. So, and it's really difficult to imagine that once upon a time that koalas were so numerous that they were killed for their skins in their millions, and estimates of 8 million koalas exported for the trade in fur up until about 1927. But the koala's in trouble, as John has indicated. It's been formally recognised as threatened since 1992 in legislation. There's been a 26% decline in the New South Wales population over the last 3 koala generations, the last 18 years or so. And there were likely severe effects of the 2019 bushfires. And the lack of the broad-scale recovery of the population of koalas since it was recognised as threatened all those decades ago is really alarming. As a conservationist, as a scientist, that's alarming. But there is a high level of community concern and support for koala conservation. And there is government commitment at all levels to recovering and conserving the species. And no single agency or entity can implement koala conservation or population recovery. It relies on deliberate and applied and coordinated effort from government at all levels, research institutions and non-government organisations, advocacy groups and the community, importantly, to affect koala recovery and conservation. So the fundamental principles of recovering and conserving a threatened species like the koala are simple. Enhance and conserve koala habitat, and that can be occupied habitat or unoccupied habitat. Create new habitat and corridors for movement, and manage the things that are threatening adult survival and juvenile recruitment. Simple, right? Not so simple. The current status of koalas suggests that conservation and recovery is very difficult and very complex. And if we can't preserve and protect a cherished and iconic species like the koala, and to recognise their intrinsic right to live freely and to provide our children and their children the joy of experiencing them in the wild, then what hope is there for other threatened species that aren't so iconic, or biodiversity conservation more broadly? Importantly, koalas are an umbrella species, which means that their conservation has cascade effects on other species and biodiversity in general. And we should recognise that koalas are a landscape species. They are very complex in their social interactions. They have this incredible dependency on mother and young, a high degree of social connectedness, and they move across landscapes. And so we have to apply a landscape focus when we're managing and conserving koalas in the wild. And also to manage the koala, we need information. And we are building this picture, but it's a lot of data remains outstanding. So research and additional knowledge is very important. Koalas on the mid-coast, so John's sort of already touched on this. I've again shown the sightings of koalas on BioNet, and intuitively we've identified 25 or so clusters or hubs of koalas across the MidCoast Council area. And so the whole of the area is utilised by koalas, from coastal sand masses and headlands, the river valleys, coastal ranges, and up into the Barrington tops. There are clusters of higher density populations. Our highest priority for immediate conservation action is the Kaiwarik population, which is centred around Tanoni. It is high density, high abundance. It's a good breeding population and an important source of animals into surrounding landscapes. We also have priority locations, particularly in Crowdy Bay and Cat Eye, and Hawk's Nest and Tea Gardens, where there's a listed endangered koala population. The status of most of these clusters isn't well known. We know from anecdotal evidence or observation that some populations at some of these clusters have been critically damaged, catastrophically declined. Other clusters appear to be stable, but we need more information. In terms of significant food tree species, so this is for the MidCoast Council area, and those primary species, as John has indicated, are the forest red gum, the tallow wood, the various grey gums, and there's 3 different species of grey gums listed there. In low coastal country, the swamp mahogany, and other red gum species like slaty red gum and narrow-leaved red gum. They appear to be our primary species for koala food foraging. Many other species, as we've heard, are important, and I've got a list there on the left-hand side of the screen of notable browse and forage species, including species like cabbage gum and grey box, which are likely to persist up into the Hunter Valley and be present around Dungog. The ironbarks are browsed. Spotted gum is browsed, interestingly. It's an extensive list of those supporting species, but the primary species are forest red gum, tallowood, grey gum, swamp mahogany. They are the principal and primary species for us on the mid-coast. And I'd also recognise that other non-eucalypts provide very important values for koalas, such as rainforest trees for shelter in hot weather. But there is information available online, and council can certainly provide landholders with lists of preferred food trees. Yeah, we have those lists available and can respond to any inquiry in that regard. What has council done? So the council has had a history of involvement in koala research, conservation and management. We have assisted with or part-funded studies of local koala populations, particularly at Kaiwarik and at Cat Eye, at Hawk's Nest Tea Gardens and in the Koaladong area. We maintain a community koala sightings online form, which is really well utilised by the community. Over 300 community sightings have been reported via that online form. And each of those records helps us build knowledge about where koalas occur and what their current status is. It's really important to report koala sightings to either iSpy or to council through these processes. We have an offsetting process where if we're doing roadworks or another activity, if we're removing trees that we can't avoid, then we have a process where we plant 4 new koala food trees in suitable locations as an offset measure. And we have partnered with the New South Wales government to prepare a dog management brochure after a series of significant dog attacks in and around Tanoni. So we partnered on an education and engagement campaign. And we've also worked on roadkill mitigation measures at Hawk's Nest. In this location, 3 koalas were hit and killed by vehicles in a very short space of time. And our draft biodiversity framework adopts the koala as a priority, and that will be important moving forward as we focus our efforts. We also have responsibility for statutory decision making in rezonings and development applications, and we apply the rules of the state government in the determination of those applications. In terms of what we're doing moving forward, we're currently compiling a synthesis of knowledge of available references on koalas across the mid-coast. So that means that the work that's been completed in the past, which is extensive, can be retained and can inform our future management. So the work that was done for the koala planner management for Taree, it's not work that was lost, it's work that we recognise and utilise in informing the future of koala management. An exciting opportunity is a $130,000 grant from the Australian government that we've recently received for bushfire recovery work, which we're using to plant new koala habitat at places like the Boodawar Dam perimeter lands and at Cat-Eye Council reserves. We're improving road safety awareness through signage at Tanoni, and we're engaging experts to help us design and identify the best location for koala corridors in the Kaiwarik population. And we're also undertaking a tree giveaway program to landholders. We have really strong partnerships with the community and other agencies such as Hunter Local Land Services and National Parks and Wildlife Service, Forestry Corp and Department of Planning, Industry and the Environment. And these partnerships are essential. And we have an exciting concept that we believe is the future of koala conservation across the Mid-Coast Council area, and it relies on creating safe spaces and safe connections. So we are developing a trial program for the Kaiwarik koalas. We will establish koala safe spaces on council land, the Boodawar Dam perimeter lands, the Buckets Way landfill perimeter lands and other spaces, and engage with national parks and state forests to establish refuges in the landscape, safe spaces in the landscape. And from there, we will seek to engage voluntarily with private landholders to set aside additional safe spaces and safe connections across the landscape, as indicated on this plan, which I've borrowed from a Coffs Harbour connectivity corridors map, but it illustrates the concept of what we have in mind in establishing safe spaces and working voluntarily with landholders to create conservation areas and connectivity in a way that koalas can occupy the landscape safely and securely. And within the area, we then focus on managing the threats that apply within that landscape as well. As part of that concept, we would like to make Tanoni an urban safe space through engagement with private landholders, tree planting, signage and awareness. And in this way, koalas would have sufficient space to live and breed and move and we believe this is the future of koala conservation, and we would like to roll this out across the landscape. And we believe that it facilitates and enables appropriate development and land uses and primary production concurrently with koala preservation and recovery. Okay, so what can landholders do? There's 5 opportunities for landholders to participate in koala conservation. And the first of those is to better understand and our local koalas and their plight. Report any koala sighting to iSpy or the council online form. And if you can, spend time in nature and learn what a koala sounds like and what their droppings look like. Be familiar with where they live and what their preferred food trees look like. And koalas, by the way, make a very guttural growl that's unlike anything you would imagine a koala to make. But it's if you've heard it, it's a pretty amazing noise. But yeah, spend time in nature and learn about our koalas. Secondly is care, and critically is care. Please report any sighting of any koala that you suspect to be sick or injured in the MidCoast area to Koalas in Care immediately on their 24-hour hotline mobile number. In other areas, there are other koala care providers, but in the MidCoast, it's Koalas in Care. Koalas in Care have decades of experience in koala emergency care and treatment. As I say, their mobile number is a 24-hour hotline. Reporting deceased animals is also very important, so we can understand why. We can perform autopsies. And if you are unsure if a koala is well or unwell, still contact Koalas in Care, and they will evaluate and guide you through the process of determining the appropriate course of action. The third step is to protect. Please protect koalas. Be mindful of koalas near roads, especially near where koala warning signs are. If you happen to hit a koala, and these things do happen, please stop. Please cover the koala with a towel or blanket and remove it from the road and call Koalas in Care immediately or a koala carer immediately. If you're a dog owner, be responsible. Please keep your dog under effective control. If a dog attacks a koala, again, please remove your dog from the situation. Immediately contact the koala carers and protect the koala with a blanket. As John indicated, even a quite innocent looking bite can become seriously infected and lead to a koala's death. The fourth thing is accommodate koalas as best you can if you have the space. Protect habitat and trees on your property, whether that's residential lot or a rural residential or a rural landholding. If you have space, please plant additional food trees and habitat and shelter trees and establish new koala habitat areas and linkages. It's good advice to match the species selection with the soil landscape. So it's not effective to plant a species like swamp mahogany that occurs in coastal lowlands and wet areas on ridge tops. So match the tree to species to the soil types. And please look out for the opportunities that we have coming up where funding for tree planting or habitat protection is likely to be available, and we will advise for participation in these programs as they arise. And finally, and my last slide, and thanks for your patience and interest, is appreciate and advocate. Recognize the value of koalas, appreciate and advocate for them. They are special, they are unique, and together I'm really hopeful that we can create a secure future for koalas, and we can do this within the context of well-planned growth and development and primary production. If you're able to, please enjoy the amazing nature and biodiversity of the Mid-Coast region, from the Barrington Tops through to the coast, and please be a steward and custodian of our natural environment.